A massive fire reduced my villa to ashes. My parents, my younger brother, and my fiancée all supposedly perished in the flames. But I knew none of them were dead. At that very moment, they were probably lounging on some tropical island laughing at my misery. And all because my two-faced younger brother claimed that I had bullied him again. My blatantly biased parents decided I needed to be taught a lesson. Even my fiancée joined in on their scheme. They wanted me to lose everyone I loved and be buried under a mountain of debt, all so I would finally recognize my so-called mistakes. I laughed. I had been wondering how I could take complete control of the company. And now they had handed me the perfect opportunity on a silver platter. Acting anyone could do that. Standing amid the ruins, I put on the most heartbreaking farewell performance imaginable. At the same time, I had all four of them officially declared dead and removed from the civil registry. Go ahead and enjoy yourselves out there. Let's see how you plan to come back now. Breaking news swept through City A that morning. At approximately midnight last night, a massive fire broke out at an exclusive private vacation villa in the western outskirts of the city. Due to strong winds and the villa's remote location, the entire building had already been reduced to ashes by the time firefighters arrived. Following an initial search and examination of the scene, no signs of survivors have been found. The cause of the fire remains under investigation. I sat on the living room sofa staring expressionlessly at the charred ruins on the television screen. The villa was owned by the Chan family, and last night a family celebration had been held there. The guests included my biological parents, my younger brother Santino, and my fiancée, Michelle Mu. She had attended the banquet in my place because I had been too busy with work to be there. My phone screen was flashing nonstop. Ever since midnight, I had been bombarded with calls. Company executives, senior members of the board, people from the Mu family, reporters who had caught wind of the story, and all those so-called friends who usually treated me like a brother whenever we crossed paths in our social circle. I did not answer a single call. I merely leaned back against the sofa and watched the police cordon off the ruins on television. Then I let out a sigh. I had already given all of you a chance. Since you refused to appreciate it and insisted on leaving yourselves no way back, I had no choice but to make sure you really did die. Do not misunderstand. I was not some deranged murderer who had burned his entire family alive just to seize their fortune. I had not started the fire, nor was there a single real corpse at the scene. It was a long story. To put it simply, my dear younger brother Santino had started acting up again. Only this time the stunt he pulled was far more extreme than his usual petty games for attention and affection. This time he had carefully planned an elaborate fake death scheme. Using the helpless, vulnerable act he had perfected over the years, he successfully manipulated my parents, who had favored him our entire lives. He convinced them that their eldest son was cold-blooded, heartless, domineering, and desperately needed to be taught a harsh lesson. Even more laughably, Michelle, who had always prided herself on being cool-headed and rational, had also fallen for his fragile little act. Not only had she agreed to help conceal the truth, but she had willingly become an accomplice in their fake death plot. The four of them had conspired to transfer an enormous amount of liquid capital out of the Chan Group's accounts. Then they had staged the fire. According to Santino's laughably idiotic plan, they were probably already aboard a cruise ship or private jet, secretly fleeing the country with that fortune and preparing to travel around the world. What had they left for me? The devastating blow of losing my parents, my brother, and my fiancée in a fire. And the staggering debts and imminent collapse of the Chan Group after its cash flow had been completely cut off. Did it sound like the plot of some brain-dead, over-the-top melodramatic web series? I thought so too. Yet they had actually gone through with it. In their imagination, I should have completely broken down by now. I should have been like a beaten dog who had lost everything, kneeling before the ruins and sobbing uncontrollably. I should have been desperately searching for the truth while drowning in regret, wondering whether I had truly gone too far all these years. Then, once the debts had crushed me and dragged me deep into the mud, Santino-chan would return with our parents and Michelle. They would stand above me like judges passing down a sentence and enjoy the sight of my misery. What a shame. Kevin Chan had never been the kind of idiot who stayed in one place wailing helplessly at the sky. I had discovered the account Santino was using to secretly transfer the money long ago. I had known exactly what they were doing from beginning to end. I simply chose not to expose them. Instead, I quietly watched as they set the fire themselves. Because I knew these people far too well. Santino would never stop stirring up trouble. My parents and Michelle would always listen to only his side of the story and assume I was bullying someone weaker than me. Since they were so determined to teach me a lesson this way, there was nothing else I could do. I could only play along. I walked into the bathroom and splashed cold water over my face. Looking at the bloodshot eyes in the mirror after a sleepless night, I tugged the corner of my mouth upward in satisfaction. According to the script they had written for me, I had received an emergency call from the company around midnight and rushed off to deal with an unexpected crisis. That was why Michelle had attended the family celebration in my place. And I really had gone to the company last night. They had tried to lure me away, but instead they had conveniently provided me with a perfect alibi. I had been working until the early hours of the morning, so it was entirely reasonable that I had missed all those calls. I changed into a slightly rumpled shirt and did not even bother shaving. Then I drove straight to the fire scene in the western suburbs. When I stumbled through the outer police cordon, every reporter and rescue worker turned to look at me. Facing the charred ruins that were still spewing black smoke, I began the performance of my life. I did not scream hysterically like a madman. That would not have suited the calm, composed image Kevin Chan had always maintained. Instead, I simply stared at the ruins with bloodshot eyes. It was as though every ounce of strength had been drained from my body. I dropped heavily to my knees in the ashes. Then I reached out with both hands and began digging desperately through the scorching blackened debris without saying a word. I kept digging until my fingertips were torn open and blood mixed with soot beneath my nails. Yet I continued the same mechanical movements as though I could no longer feel pain. The sight of a man suppressing his anguish to the breaking point, unable to accept the reality before him, immediately moved everyone present. Several firefighters approached me with reddened eyes and tried to pull me away. "Mr. Chan, please accept our condolences." Camera flashes erupted wildly beyond the police line. Within half an hour, the hashtag Chan air digs through fire ruins with bare hands had exploded across social media. People everywhere expressed sympathy for the poor man who had lost his entire family and the woman he loved overnight. Meanwhile, aboard a luxury ferry bound for Southeast Asia, Kevin's family, the same people supposedly killed in the fire, were enjoying the warm sunshine, refreshing sea breeze, and champagne. Michelle reclined on a deck chair with her phone in her hand. A video was playing on the screen. It showed Kevin at the ruins, exhausted and disheveled, his hands covered in blood. Seeing him look as though his entire world had collapsed, Michelle's usually cool and distant expression tightened. For the first time, a trace of guilt flickered in her eyes. "Kevin, do you think this has been too much of a shock for him?" she murmured to herself, unconsciously brushing her fingers across the screen. The moment her resolve began to waver, Santino, who was lying beside her, immediately sensed that something was wrong. He sat up at once, his eyes instantly turning red. "Michelle, it hurts me so much to see my brother like this too." He lowered his head, his voice thick with grievance and self-blame as he launched into his usual manipulative performance. "But if we hadn't done this, he would never have understood how important his family is. He would have kept looking down on us and controlling everything. He has always treated me like I'm nothing but a useless loser. I only wanted to teach him a lesson. I wanted him to learn how to appreciate the people around him." "Michelle, did I do something wrong?" Seeing their younger son looking so fragile and on the verge of tears, the Chan parents immediately sat up, their hearts aching for him. "Santino, what nonsense are you talking about? What could you possibly have done wrong?" My mother took Santino's hand, then turned toward Michelle and spoke with righteous indignation. "Michelle, Kevin has been cold and heartless since he was a child. He is far too controlling. If we don't teach him a proper lesson, who knows how badly he'll bully Santino in the future. Let him panic back home for a few days. After we've spent a few months enjoying ourselves and return, he'll finally understand how precious it is to have his whole family alive and well." Listening to Santino play the victim and my parents reinforce his twisted logic, Michelle fell silent. She looked into Santino's eyes, which made him appear as though he had suffered an unimaginable injustice. Then she remembered how Kevin always had the final say at the company, how forceful he was, and how he never bowed his head to anyone. In the end, she took a deep breath and switched off her phone. That was right. Kevin was too domineering. He was like a machine that would never break down. Their plan might have been a little cruel, but they were doing it for his own good. Only after experiencing real pain would he reflect on his behavior. Only then would he learn how to love the people around him. Michelle repeated those thoughts to herself until she successfully silenced her conscience. She picked up the glass of juice beside her and settled back into the deck chair. Then she closed her eyes and let the sea breeze wash over her. After leaving the hospital with both hands bandaged, I did not even bother changing out of the shirt stained with soot and blood. I had the driver take me straight to the Mu family villa. The moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere in the living room was so oppressive that it was almost suffocating. Michelle's mother sat on the sofa, her eyes swollen and red from crying. She clutched a photograph of Michelle Mu tightly in her hands, sobbing so hard she could barely speak. The instant Michelle's father Mason saw me walk in, the grief in his eyes transformed into blazing fury. "You still have the nerve to show your face here?" He stormed toward me, pointed a finger in my face, and roared in a hoarse voice. "Kevin, it's bad enough that you're always obsessed with work, but last night was your own family gathering. Michelle only went because she was attending in your place. What could possibly have been so urgent? Was the company collapsing? What could have mattered more than my daughter's life?" Faced with his relentless accusations and furious insults, I did not defend myself. I simply lowered my head and allowed him to vent. I stared at my hands, both wrapped in thick white bandages, and remained silent for a long time. Finally, I let out a weary, helpless sigh. "Uncle Mason, no matter how you look at it, this is all my fault." I raised my head, bitterness filling my bloodshot eyes. If I hadn't gone to the company last night, Michelle wouldn't have attended the gathering at the villa in my place. And then she wouldn't have. I paused at exactly the right moment, my voice trembling slightly. It was as though I could not bear to say the word died. But I had no choice. I had to deal with that emergency. I took a deep breath, met Mason's gaze, and slowly dropped the bombshell. The overseas investment project Michelle had been leading recently suffered a catastrophic setback last night. An enormous sum of money simply vanished. The moment those words left my mouth, the fury on Mason's face froze. "What did you say?" He stared at me in disbelief. Of course, I was not going to tell him that Michelle had personally helped my parents and Santino steal the money so they could stage their deaths and flee the country. Instead, I kindly covered up the truth for her. Michelle made a serious error in judgment. The financial shortfall was far too large. If I hadn't spent the entire night either filling the gap or severing our connection to the project, then, when the stock market opened this morning, the Chan Group would not have been the only company to suffer a devastating blow. As the guarantor, the Mu family would also have faced a broken cash flow and possibly even bankruptcy and liquidation. I wanted to suppress the situation overnight and cover the losses for Michelle, but who could have known? I did not finish the sentence. There was no need. Mason had already fallen completely silent. He was a shrewd businessman. Of course, he understood what a cash flow collapse would mean for the Mu family. All the rage and accusations that had filled him moments ago were replaced by lingering fear and helplessness. What else could he possibly say? How could he blame me now? I had worked through the night to clean up the mess caused by his daughter's disastrous decision. I had done it to save the Mu family's entire business empire. The living room fell into a deathly silence, broken only by Michelle's mother's muffled sobs. "Uncle Mason, now that things have reached this point, there is only one way forward. The Mu family must immediately announce that it is withdrawing its investment unilaterally and cut its losses to survive. Shift all responsibility, debt, and the entire disastrous project onto me." Mason froze completely. He stared at me, his lips moving soundlessly as shock and emotion flashed through his eyes. "Then, what will happen to you?" If all the debt were pushed onto the Chan family, it would mean that I, Kevin Chan, would have to shoulder that enormous burden alone. I lowered my head and looked at my mangled hands. Then I forced out a bitter smile that looked even more painful than crying. "My parents are dead. My brother is gone. Even Michelle has left me. I have nothing and no one left. A man with nothing has nothing to lose. As long as the Mu family can be saved, it doesn't matter what happens to me." At those words, Michelle's mother finally stopped crying. She looked at my exhausted, haggard face. "Kevin." She walked toward me and raised a trembling hand, wanting to touch my bandaged injuries, but she was afraid of hurting me. Her voice was filled with sympathy and gratitude. "You poor child. You've suffered so much." I looked up at her, my eyes slightly red. "Auntie, please don't say that. It's just a shame. In this lifetime, I'll never have the chance to call you Mom." By the time I left the Mu residence, the performance was complete. My role in this entire incident had now been firmly established. I was the perfect yet tragic victim, a man who had lost both his family, and the woman he loved then chosen to shoulder every debt alone in order to protect his fiancée's family. The Mu family would never come after me again. Mason would only feel guilty toward me, and to preserve his daughter's reputation he would guard this secret with his life. But the business world was a battlefield. The old foxes and shareholders within the Chan Group were not running a charity. They would not show me mercy simply because I had just suffered a devastating loss. Nor would they allow me to abandon my responsibilities under the excuse of grief. The broken cash flow was real. They wanted money. They wanted an explanation. They wanted actual capital that could keep the company operating. Naturally, I had no intention of sitting back and waiting for disaster to strike. At the emergency board meeting the next morning, the shareholders slammed the table, glared at me, and demanded answers. I still had both hands wrapped in thick bandages. My face looked exhausted, but my gaze was so cold and severe that it sent a chill through the room. I wasted no time on pointless explanations. Instead, I had my assistant drop a thick stack of capital injection agreements onto the conference table. An immensely powerful overseas investment firm would inject a staggering amount of capital into the Chan Group, covering every financial shortfall. In exchange, it demanded that the board be restructured and the existing shareholders' stakes diluted. As I watched those old men stare at the documents with their mouths hanging open in shock, I lowered my eyes to conceal the cold smile in them. Of course, they had no idea that I, Kevin Chan, was the true controlling owner behind this so-called overseas investment firm. That was the real reason I had remained silent even after discovering Santino and Michelle's secret fund transfers long ago. I had known perfectly well that they planned to empty the company's accounts, fake their deaths, and flee. Yet I had done nothing to stop them. I had even watched coldly as they completed their ridiculous performance. Because this was exactly the legitimate opportunity one had been waiting for. I intended to use the crisis they had created with their own hands to my advantage. I would take the opportunity to completely reshuffle the Chan Group's tangled internal power structure and settle every old account buried within it. This enormous corporate empire would finally be placed entirely and unquestionably under my control. To be honest, sometimes I found the whole situation almost laughable. The three members of my family were all complete idiots with no business sense whatsoever. They had no ability to make money. They lacked the courage and competence to carry the group on their shoulders. All they ever thought about was playing favorites, competing for affection, and using pathetic little manipulation tactics while pretending to be innocent victims. My grandfather had seen through all of them long ago while he was still alive. Despite fierce opposition, he had handed the actual management of the Chan Group to me, not to my weak and incompetent father. All they had needed to do was stay quietly at home. With the enormous dividends I sent them every year, they could have spent their entire lives enjoying the finest luxuries wealth could offer without lifting a finger. But they were never satisfied. They insisted on stirring up trouble again and again. They insisted on testing my limits. As for why I had hidden so much from them, why I had quietly built a financial empire overseas that was even more powerful than the Chan Group, the answer was simple. How could I ever turn my back on a younger brother who had spent his entire life plotting to frame me and steal everything I had? How could I trust parents who would always defend him unconditionally? I had merely been waiting until my own power had fully matured, waiting for an opportunity to uproot them once and for all. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the president's office on the top floor overlooking the glittering expanse of City A. I raised my coffee cup and offered a distant toast to the empty air. Santino, my dear little brother, I truly should thank you. You handed me exactly what I needed at exactly the right time. 3 days later, a grand funeral that drew the attention of all City A was held as scheduled. Since no bodies had been recovered from the scene, the graves contained nothing but a few pieces of clothing dug out of the ruins. Once again, I stood alone at the center of everything and personally presided over the funeral. There was no doubt that I had become the most talked-about person in City A. Surrounded by reporters' cameras and microphones, I wore a perfectly tailored black suit with a white flower pinned to my chest. Exhaustion lingered heavily in my eyes, yet I forced a faint smile as I faced the press. Thank you all for your concern. I looked directly into the cameras. My voice was hoarse, but it carried the resilience of a man trapped in desperate circumstances. The company has indeed encountered some difficulties, and there is currently a shortfall in our funding. However, I have already reached preliminary agreements with several overseas investment firms, and we are doing everything possible to resolve the situation. Please rest assured. Even though I am now the only member of the Chan family left, I will never allow the Chan group to fall. My statement was flawless. It reassured the market while perfectly reinforcing the image of a tragic leader who had risen from the ashes to carry the burden of his entire family alone. Among the crowd, my longtime best friend Jiaqing Su approached me. His eyes reddened slightly when he saw how exhausted I looked. He gave my shoulder a firm pat. "Kevin, I'm sorry for your loss. Whatever you need, just say the word. I'll be there." I looked at him and nodded silently. After the funeral, my image was firmly etched into the minds of everyone in City A. In truth, I had not paid to promote any trending topics. Nor had I deliberately publicized the tragic love story of Michelle and me separated forever by death. Someone had simply happened to record a video and upload it online. In the video, after all the guests had left, I remained behind alone. I did not even carry an umbrella. I simply sat silently in front of Michelle's gravestone for a very, very long time. So long that even my motionless silhouette seemed to radiate a suffocating sense of despair. The video reduced countless viewers to tears. The truth was, I had not been acting. That day, I really did sit in front of her empty grave for a long time, because I truly had loved her once. As I gazed at Michelle's cool yet striking portrait on the gravestone, my thoughts drifted uncontrollably into the past. We had not exactly been childhood sweethearts, but we had known each other for many years. She was the eldest daughter of the Mu family, while I was the eldest son of the Chan family. Our families were equally matched, and so were we. We fought side by side in the business world and admired each other in our personal lives. Back then, she had been rational, clear-headed, and capable of understanding me. We could have had a perfect marriage. Then my despicable younger brother Santino began constantly stirring up trouble between us. At first, Michelle had remained perfectly clear-headed. She stood firmly on my side. Whenever Santino played the victim, she would even defend me with a cold expression. "Kevin is your older brother. He has his reasons for what he does. Stop using your poor health to guilt-trip him all the time." But I did not know when everything had begun to change. Perhaps Santino had become increasingly skilled at making himself look weak and helpless. Or perhaps he had finally awakened the condescending savior complex buried deep within her. She began to think I was cold-blooded. She thought I was too domineering, and she thought Santino was pitiful. I had warned her long ago to limit her contact with my family and stay away from Santino, but in the end I had still failed to prevent it. After hearing enough lies and witnessing enough tears, her once rational heart eventually began to favor that useless coward who knew nothing except how to pretend to be vulnerable. She had favored him so completely that she was willing to sacrifice her own reputation, steal the company's money, and fake her death alongside them, all to teach her own fiancé a so-called lesson. My memories came to an abrupt end. Cold rain struck my face. I rose from the ground and unscrewed the bottle of strong liquor I had prepared in advance. Tilting my wrist, I slowly poured the clear liquor over the cold gravestone and into the soil beneath it. "Michelle, rest in peace." I looked at the photograph of the woman I had once loved so deeply. All emotion in my eyes faded into lifeless silence. This drink would be my final farewell to her. I knew she was still alive. Perhaps she was in Europe. Perhaps she was in Australia. But in my heart, she truly was dead. The day after the funeral, I immediately set every legal procedure in motion. Since they were dead, they naturally deserved to be treated like dead people. I brought in my longtime personal legal counsel Lydia, one of the finest attorneys in City A. She wore a fitted black business suit and gold-rimmed glasses with her long hair neatly pinned behind her head. Everything about her radiated calm professional authority. Lydia had always been ruthlessly efficient. She never wasted time asking unnecessary questions. With her handling everything on my behalf, the death certificates, asset freezes, separation of liabilities, and most importantly, the cancellation of their legal identities were all processed at the fastest possible speed. When the 4 names belonging to my parents Santino and Michelle were officially marked as deceased and removed from the system, I stood on the steps outside the government administration building. Looking down at the weighty legal documents in my hands, I let out a long breath. It was more than just a sigh of relief. At that moment, every shackle and grievance that had weighed on my heart for more than 20 years finally disappeared. Legally speaking, they had been completely erased from the world. Even if they squandered all the money overseas one day and tried to return with their passports, they would be met with invalid identities, frozen bank accounts, and the status of people who no longer legally existed. Why does it feel like? Walking beside me, Lydia came to a stop. Her beautiful eyes narrowed slightly behind her gold-rimmed glasses as she studied me with curiosity and suspicion. Now that you've finished processing your family's deaths, you finally look completely relaxed. She was far too intelligent. All it took was the slightest change in my expression for her to see through to what I was truly feeling. I turned toward her and studied her cool, strikingly sharp features. Attorney Lydia, you're as perceptive as ever. But knowing too much isn't always a good thing. Half joking and half serious, I warned her people who know too much should be careful walking alone at night. Instead of being intimidated, Lydia stepped a little closer. A faint, woody perfume lingered in the air. She tilted her chin upward and leaned closer to me, her red lips parting. Walking alone at night really can be dangerous. So aren't you going to escort me home? I walked straight to the roadside, opened the front passenger door, and looked at her. Where to? Without the slightest hesitation, Lydia bent down and slid into the car. She crossed her long legs, turned toward me, and gave me a provocative smile. Wherever you take me. Half an hour later, the Maybach came to a smooth stop beneath an upscale apartment building in downtown City A. It was Lydia's own residence. Looking through the window at the familiar entrance, Lydia paused with one hand on her seatbelt. She turned and shot me an annoyed look before letting out a cold scoff. Seriously, you're hopelessly unromantic. With that, she pushed open the door and prepared to step out in her high heels. Lydia. Sitting behind the wheel, I called out to her. She stopped and looked back at me. With both hands resting on the steering wheel, I met her gaze. The teasing tone from earlier was gone, replaced by a solemn promise. Give me a little more time. Right now isn't the right moment. I had only just held a devastatingly tragic funeral in front of the entire city. If I became involved with another woman immediately afterward, it would not only destroy the image I had worked so carefully to establish, but also drag Lydia into the center of a public scandal. She was intelligent, and she was a woman who deserved respect and sincerity. I would never let her shoulder any unnecessary blame at a time like this. Lydia looked into my eyes. The faint displeasure in hers vanished instantly. Of course, she understood my concerns. She also understood exactly what I was planning. I know. She gave a soft huff, though the corners of her lips could not help curving upward. Then she stepped out in her high heels and walked into the apartment building without looking back. All she left me was a graceful, confident silhouette. 1 year later, on a sun-drenched beach somewhere in the United States, Michelle lay on a lounge chair wearing an expensive designer sun protection jacket, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. Their year-long fake death vacation had not been nearly as relaxing or enjoyable as she had imagined. Without Kevin, the man who had always arranged everything flawlessly, she had finally realized that Santino was good for nothing except playing the victim and demanding constant emotional reassurance. Whenever they encountered a real problem, all he ever did was make excuses and complain. Suddenly, a financial interview appeared on her social media feed back home. Her finger froze against the screen. The title read, "Rising from the Ashes. How City A's new business titan Kevin Chan turned the tide." Michelle's breath caught. Almost instinctively, she tapped on the video. On-screen, Kevin was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his presence calm, powerful, and commanding. He had not been destroyed by the financial crisis as they had expected. Nor had he become a debt-ridden loser reduced to kneeling and begging for mercy. On the contrary, through a series of ruthless and decisive moves, he had not only survived the crisis but staged a spectacular comeback and completely restructured the Chan Group. He was now one of the most powerful entrepreneurs in City A. Michelle stared fixedly at the screen, her fingertips trembling. During the second half of the interview, the host smiled and shifted the conversation from business to Kevin's personal life. She asked how he had managed to recover from losing everyone closest to him over the past year. Kevin's usually cold, piercing eyes instantly softened. He turned his head and naturally reached for Lydia's hand beside him. "I owe it all to Lydia and the way she has taken care of me this past year." Kevin tightened his grip on Lydia's hand and looked into the camera, his voice low and resolute. "She helped me escape the darkness of losing everything. And she gave me the courage to begin a new life." The live comments flooded across the screen. Oh my god, so attorney Lydia, who's always ice cold during her live streams, actually knows how to blush. I ship them so hard. This is literally a real-life healing romance. Look at the way Kevin is staring at her. He's completely smitten. Michelle watched Lydia lower her head slightly, a shy smile tugging at her lips. It felt as though an invisible hand had wrapped itself around Michelle's heart and was squeezing it mercilessly. Even every breath seemed to carry the metallic taste of blood. At the end of the video, Kevin smiled and shared an even more explosive piece of news with the audience. I'd also like to take this opportunity to share some happy news. He raised Lydia's hand, revealing the diamond ring on her finger. His eyes overflowed with tenderness. A few days ago, I proposed to Lydia, and she said yes. As the host exclaimed in delight and showered them with congratulations, the video slowly came to an end and the screen went dark. A deafening buzz filled Michelle's head. Her mind went completely blank. How could this have happened? Not only had Kevin refused to break down, but he had not even searched the world for them. He had already forgotten Michelle completely. And now he was going to openly and legally marry another woman. A tidal wave of panic and indescribable regret crashed over her. Only now, as she looked at Kevin's confident and triumphant face on the screen, did she finally wake up to the truth. Their so-called fake death lesson had never punished Kevin at all. They were the ones who had lost everything. Their little game had backfired spectacularly. Michelle shot to her feet so abruptly that she did not even bother picking up the sunglasses that fell to the ground. Still wearing her high heels, she stormed back to the oceanfront hotel suite. The door flew open with a deafening bang. Santino jumped in fright. Michelle strode over, seized him by the collar, and hauled him off the sofa. Then she shoved her phone screen directly in front of his face. Santino, take a good look at what your brilliant idea has done. Her eyes were bloodshot and her voice trembled with barely contained rage and panic. This is what you called teaching him a lesson. Not only has he taken complete control of the Chan group, but now he's marrying another woman. You played all of us for fools. Santino stared at the image of Kevin looking confident and successful on the screen. His face instantly turned deathly pale. A flash of extreme jealousy and twisted fury crossed his eyes. He wanted to lose his temper. He wanted to smash everything in sight. But the fragile, innocent persona he had carefully maintained for more than 20 years held him firmly in check. He had no choice but to force his anger back down. His eyes reddened as he shrank away like a frightened animal and protested weakly, Michelle, don't take it out on me. When I first suggested the plan, you agreed to it too. Those words struck Michelle like a vicious slap across the face. She clenched her jaw and glared at the useless man before her, who did nothing but shift the blame whenever something went wrong. She wanted to slap herself. What on earth had possessed her back then? Why had she ever agreed to such an absurd fake death scheme? Was it simply because this useless man who could accomplish nothing and only knew how to cry had complained to her a few times that his brother was bullying him for such a ridiculous reason she had given up a perfect partner like Kevin, a man who could always shield her from every storm? Just as the tension in the suite reached its breaking point, the Chan parents, who were staying next door, heard the commotion and hurried inside. Oh my, what happened? Why are you suddenly fighting? Mrs. Chan rushed forward and protectively pulled Santino out of Michelle's grasp. After learning what had happened, the two of them immediately began trying to smooth things over. Michelle, don't blame Santino. And Kevin, how could he fall for someone else so quickly? Mr. Chan stood beside her, putting on the dignified air of an elder as he waved dismissively. That's enough. Since Kevin has managed the company so well and we've had our fill of traveling, it's time for us to go home. He turned toward Michelle. Don't worry too much. Kevin has always been deeply sentimental. That female attorney is probably nothing more than an emotional crutch for him. Once we return and explain everything clearly, we'll tell him that this was merely a test meant to teach him to appreciate his family. He loved you so much. The moment he sees that you're still alive, he'll definitely cast that attorney aside and come back to you. Michelle listened to the Chan parents' utterly illogical yet unbelievably confident claims. Slowly, she loosened her clenched fists. She took a deep breath and stared at Kevin's familiar face in the video. She could only repeat their words in her mind, desperately trying to convince herself that they were true. That was right. Kevin had once loved her so deeply that when the Mu family had faced bankruptcy, he had been willing to shoulder every debt alone for her sake. How could he possibly have truly stopped loving her as long as she went back? As long as she stood before him again and told him she was still alive. Everything could still return to the way it had been. Today was my wedding to Lydia. In the dressing room, Lydia stood before the mirror in a custom-made couture wedding gown and slowly let out a breath. I walked over, wrapped my arms around her shoulders from behind, and asked with a smile, "What's this? Even attorney Lydia, who can tear an entire courtroom apart with her arguments, gets nervous on her wedding day?" Lydia looked at me through the mirror and frowned slightly. I don't know why, but my right eyelid has been twitching all day. I can't shake the feeling that something bad is going to happen. I gently patted her shoulder. My tone was relaxed but carried absolute confidence. "Don't worry. I specifically arranged twice the usual number of security guards for today. After all, these people had been capable of staging their entire family's deaths and fleeing with stolen money. Who knew what even more idiotic stunt they might try next? Better safe than sorry." Lydia's tense shoulders finally relaxed and a faint smile appeared on her lips. The first half of the wedding went perfectly. With City A's most prominent figures and the media watching, we exchanged vows and rings surrounded by a sea of flowers. When I lifted her veil and kissed her deeply beneath thunderous applause, I finally felt that my life had truly begun anew. However, just as we left the ceremony and returned to the backstage lounge, something finally happened. Jessie, the female bodyguard in charge of security, approached us quickly. "Boss, we caught a few people backstage." Jessie reported expressionlessly. "They were sneaking around near the rear entrance and tried to force their way inside. They were clearly up to no good, so I had the team restrain them immediately." I nodded and took Lydia's hand. "Let's go take a look." When we entered the backstage security room, 4 people were pinned to the floor by my bodyguards in a tangled heap. Their clothes were torn and filthy, their hair was matted, and an indescribably sour stench clung to their bodies. It was obvious that returning to City A had taken an extraordinary amount of effort. After all, the 4 of them were legally dead and had been completely erased from the system. Without valid passports or identification, getting back into City A could not have been easy. Although they now looked like homeless beggars from the street, I recognized Michelle immediately. But as I looked at them, there was no shock in my eyes. No anger. Not even the slightest emotional reaction. It was as though I were looking at 4 complete strangers. Kevin, the moment Michelle saw me, her face lit up with wild joy. She struggled desperately, trying to throw herself toward me. Her voice was so hoarse it was barely recognizable. "It's me, I'm Michelle. I'm not dead. None of us are dead. That fire was staged. We were only playing a joke on you, Kevin. I'm back." My parents, who were also pinned to the floor, reacted, as though they had finally found a lifeline, and hurriedly shouted along with her. "Kevin, it's Mom and Dad. We only went away on a trip. We just wanted to test you. Tell these bodyguards to let us go. Santino is frail. He can't handle being held down like this." Listening to their entitled explanations, I did not order the bodyguards to release them. Instead, I took half a step back and frowned in disgust. Then I turned my head and asked casually, "Jessie, including these, for how many groups of scammers have come here pretending to be my family?" She thought seriously for a moment. "Boss, if I remember correctly, this should be the 8th group. Although the previous scammers were all dressed fairly well. This group certainly committed to the act. They actually look like undocumented drifters." I nodded in agreement before turning back toward the 4 stunned people on the floor. I spread my hands. "You heard her. My family and my former fiancé were burned to ashes in that fire more than a year ago. The authorities issued their death certificates and the entire city's media witnessed their funeral. Now you're impersonating dead people and attempting to blackmail the chairman of the Chan Group. Do you understand what that means? It's illegal. It's fraud." The moment I said those words, Michelle looked as though she had been struck by lightning. She stared into my eyes, the eyes of a man looking at a piece of garbage, and finally realized that I was not merely giving her the cold shoulder. I genuinely regarded her as a dead woman. "No, that's not true." Michelle shook her head desperately. Her tears carved 2 clean tracks through the grime covering her face. She cried out in utter despair, her voice shrill with anguish. "Kevin, we're really who we say we are. Look at me carefully. I'm Michelle." Hearing me mercilessly label them as fraudster, Santino, who had been pinned to the floor the entire time, finally snapped. He struggled to raise his head, his mud-smeared face twisting with rage. "Kevin, stop pretending you don't recognize us. We can take blood tests. We can do DNA tests. We're your biological family. We're still alive." He glared at me, his eyes filled with resentment and fear. "You knew everything from the beginning, didn't you? You wanted us dead, so you could take the entire Chan family fortune for yourself." Faced with the hysterical desperation of a cornered animal, I could not even be bothered to respond. At that moment, Lydia, who had been standing beside me, stepped forward. She adjusted the gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose and spoke in a calm, decisive voice. If you insist on legally proving that you are the 3 deceased members of the Chan family and Michelle Mu, then restoring your identities and returning to your privileged lives will be the least of your concerns." She watched their expressions freeze. Then her red lips parted, delivering an icy verdict. "As former executives and relatives connected to the Chan Group, you would be suspected of staging a fire, faking your deaths, and fleeing overseas with an enormous amount of corporate capital. That constitutes embezzlement, deliberate fraud, and major financial crimes. The moment your identities are confirmed, you will almost certainly spend the rest of your lives behind bars." Lydia smiled faintly, her gaze filled with open mockery. "So are you going to leave now, or would you prefer to keep causing trouble?" Her words struck the 4 of them like a bolt from the blue. A meaningless choking sound escaped Santino Chan's throat. My parents went completely limp with fear and no longer had the strength to struggle. They had finally realized the truth. Not only were they legally dead, but the moment they proved they were alive, they would become wanted criminals facing decades in prison. "No, Kevin." Michelle completely broke down. Somehow she found a sudden burst of strength and tore herself free from the bodyguards restraining her. She scrambled toward me on her hands and knees, desperately trying to grab the cuff of my trousers. "Kevin, I was wrong. I know I was wrong now. Please save me." Before her hand could touch me, Jessie's eyes sharpened. Without hesitation, she drove a swift, vicious kick into Michelle's shoulder. There was a dull thud. Michelle was sent flying backward and crashed heavily into the corner of the room. She curled up on the floor in agony, unable to utter a single word. I glanced at her coldly, without the slightest ripple of emotion. After all these people had tried to destroy my life, I showed no mercy to my enemies. I turned away, took Lydia's hand, and spoke gently. "Let's go. The guests out front must be getting impatient." Lydia tightened her fingers around mine and gave me a radiant smile. Later, the 3 remaining members of the Chan family caused another scene outside my house. Since they stubbornly insisted that they were the supposedly deceased members of the Chan family and kept spouting what everyone considered delusional nonsense, I had the perfect justification to let Jessie deal with them. She had all 3 of them taken straight to a fully secured psychiatric institution in the most remote part of City A. As for Michelle, she dragged her battered body back to the Mu family villa. Filthy and disheveled like a beggar, she stumbled the entire way. She tried to explain everything to her biological parents. She tried to reclaim her former position as the pampered heiress of the Mu family. But she was far too naive. The only reason the Mu family could still wield influence in City A was the fragile connection they had managed to preserve with me. If Mason acknowledged her now, it would be the same as publicly admitting that the Mu family had participated in the fraud and completely turning me, Kevin Chan, against them. Besides, when Michelle Mu stole that enormous sum of money, she had shown no concern whatsoever for whether the Mu family survived. Had I not possessed the ability to turn the situation around, there was no telling whether the Mu family would even have been able to put food on the table today. Faced with a selfish disaster of a daughter who had nearly destroyed the entire family, Mason made the coldest and most practical choice. He stood inside the villa gates and stared at the filthy, foul-smelling woman outside. His gaze was colder than ice. "My daughter Michelle died in that fire more than a year ago. Who is this lunatic? Get her out of here." At that moment, kneeling outside the tightly shut gates of the Mu family villa, Michelle finally understood the true meaning of despair and total abandonment. As someone whose legal identity had been erased from the system, she could not even get a job on a factory assembly line. She had no choice but to hide in the dirtiest, most rundown neighborhood in City A and wash dishes at a small restaurant. Whenever night fell and everything became quiet, she would stare at her hands, rough and cracked from being soaked in filthy water day after day. Her mind would always return to the Kevin who had once treasured her above everything else and protected her from every storm. Then she would break down in tears, drowning in endless regret. Meanwhile, at that very moment, in the most luxurious hillside estate in City A, Lydia walked out of the bathroom holding a pregnancy test marked with 2 lines. Her usually composed and professional face was now flushed with a rare mixture of surprise and joy at the thought of becoming a mother. "Kevin." She walked over and gently wrapped her arms around my waist. Looking up at me, her eyes shone like stars. "We're having a baby." I froze for a moment. Then I pulled her tightly into my arms and pressed a deep kiss to her forehead. "That's wonderful, Lydia." I had long since left that cesspool of misery behind and stepped into a brand new life.